Hello there, everyone. My name is Jimmy Mack, and welcome back to the 11th Academic Podcast. This is going to be the NS2 textbook Maritime History, Chapter 4, The Civil War. Now, at the time, slavery was illegal in the northern states, but it was legal in the southern states, and so the southern states made absolutely sure that as the Union expanded, there would be at least as many slave states as there were free states, so that they couldn't get overpowered in Congress. Now, Abraham Lincoln was a relatively middle-of-the-road Republican candidate. However, he did object to slavery, and specifically spreading slavery to new states in the Union, on moral grounds. This meant that southern states, specifically South Carolina, announced that they would secede from the Union if he was elected. In this candidate, however, the Democrats ran two candidates, and the Whig Party also ran a candidate of their own, meaning that he was opposed by three candidates, which split votes in the South and meant that Lincoln won with 40% of the popular vote. And as promised, South Carolina seceded, as well as six other states. So the Confederate States of America were formed with South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Of course, the rest of the United States wasn't too happy with this, and war followed. Once Lincoln started asking for other volunteers to help quash the rebellion, however, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia also joined the Confederacy. However, the western part of Virginia didn't want to fight the Union and thus joined it as West Virginia. Now, the first battle of the war, the Battle of Bull Run, ended in a northern battle pretty close to Washington and basically let everyone know, hey, this war is going to be pretty serious. We can't just kick these guys right back into submission pretty early, and this is going to take a lot of doing. Now, the North had blockaded the South because they get most of their money from exporting the cotton they produce, so it was pretty desperate for their economy that they be able to export it, so the North was like, hey, let's block these guys out. However, the U.S. has a massive coastline, so it's pretty hard for them to do this, so the South was like, oh man, I really hope the British will start running this blockade in order to buy our cotton. So what they do is they sent some diplomats to try and get Britain to recognize them as a legitimate nation. However, they are intercepted by the Union sloop, the San Jacinto, and so they basically stopped this British ship and kept them captive. But that is not a good idea because that's pretty close to bringing the British into the war on the side of the Confederacy since the Union's capturing their stuff. So we settle that diplomatically, call it the Trent Affair, and be like, oh, sorry, and move on. The Union did a lot of operations up in the Tennessee and Mississippi rivers, led in part by Ulysses S. Grant, which is what helped him make a name for himself. And we had pretty large success in that, pretty much foreshadowing the eventual defeat of the Confederacy, while also causing them quite a few problems. Now, in middle 1862, Captain David Farragut captures the port of New Orleans from the Confederacy. This is huge because, first off, this is a major port for the Confederacy, and so taking it greatly hampers their economy, which is already greatly struggling under the war. And second off, we've basically shown the rest of the world, hey, look at these clowns, we just took their biggest port. And so Britain's like, oh, not going to recognize these guys, not going to help them out. And so we've basically scared off other nations from getting involved to help what is essentially a puny rebellion. Now, the Union has a ship called the Merrimac, which is a steam frigate that was burned and scuttled by Union forces when they couldn't use it anymore. The Confederates found the ship, raised her up, and then started converting her into an ironclad, which they named the Virginia. And basically, it had sides that sloped all the way up, so that any shot that hit it wouldn't hit it straight on and would thus bounce off it harmlessly. Now, when the Union Navy heard about this, they started making a ship of their own called the USS Monitor, and it too was an ironclad specifically designed to withstand cannon fire, but instead of trying to make it bounce off, what it did is it left only like 6 inches of freeboard, so that it was pretty much just a flat plane barely above the surface of the water at all, so it was just hard to hit, period. And it had a big turret in the middle so that it could still fire its cannon. The word cannon there, of course, being the plural, because the plural of cannon is cannon. Now, the Monitor was guarding Hampton Roads, and the Virginia rolled into Hampton Roads, and so we began the Battle of Hampton Roads. So first off, the Virginia plows two non-ironclads, the USS Cumberland and the Congress, and it basically manages to sink both of them. However, when she turns on the when she turns on the Monitor, neither one can really do any damage to the other because they're both so well protected. And so it's a long 4-hour close-range duel until the Virginia runs aground. However, a lucky shot explodes right in front of the viewing slits in the Monitor, and so there was the last order that the commander had given was sheer off, and then he was blinded and wounded in the face, and so he couldn't give any more orders, and so the Monitor kept pulling away, and during that time the Virginia freed itself and ran away. So it was a pretty close battle once the two ironclads got head to head. So the battle ended indecisively. After this battle, seeing their effectiveness, the Union builds a whole bunch more casemate ironclads, which are similar to the Virginia but with masts. However, the Confederacy is unable to do so because their economy is pretty crippled at this point in the war. At this point, to delay the inevitable, Robert E. Lee stages the first invasion of the North into Maryland. And at this point, the Battle of Antietam Creek near Sharpsburg happens, which is the bloodiest single-day engagement in the entire Civil War. The Union wins a very costly victory, but Lee manages to buy some time for the Union. At this point, Abraham Lincoln releases the Emancipation Proclamation, which frees all slaves within the 10 Confederate states which are still in rebellion. It is important to note that 4 had defected to the Union at this point, with promises of Lincoln's protection later on from having their slaves freed. I'm sure this went very well. Spoiler alert, all the slaves were freed. However, the Emancipation Proclamation was not what did it. For that, you're going to have to wait. Now, the Union desired to cut off the Confederacy from basically anything else, so they'd done this on the ocean with the help of the blockade, but now they wanted to cut them off over land from any other states as well as Mexico. So, Farragut was going to fight his way up the Mississippi, and some Union ships were going to meet him, fighting their way down it, until they met at a Confederate fort in Vicksburg. Now, they did this after a lot of fighting, and they sieged it for 40 days, but at the end of it, we managed to starve the Confederates out and cut them off of the Mississippi entirely, which basically meant that they were isolated. Now, in the wake of this, and as well as a battle in which just after winning a decisive victory, the Confederacy loses a star general, Stonewall Jackson, anyway after he's shot by his own men by mistake, Robert E. Lee is like, heck, I need to do something now. So he does a desperate gamble and tries invading the North again. However, he is once again turned back, this time at the Battle of Gettysburg, which is the largest overall engagement and bloodiest in the Civil War. However, he loses it, and this is the turning point of the war. Next up, the Confederates made the Davids, which were a series of semi-submersible ships which worked pretty well as offensive ships, and they also made the Hunley, which did not work very well at all. It killed 5 of its crews and only managed to sink 1 Union ship. Now, in the Confederate effort to do anything to hurt the Union, they started authorizing, first off, blockade runners to help out their own economy, but also privateers, the most successful of which was Captain Raphael Semmes, whose ship, the Alabama, managed to sink a whole bunch of Union ships, but eventually was sunk itself before Semmes escaped into England to avoid capture. Next up, the Union sets its sights on another strategic Confederate shipping port. This one is called Mobile Bay. However, the Confederacy, seeing that this is probably going to happen, they moored a whole bunch of torpedoes in the bay, torpedoes being mines, that's just what they called them back then, in order to try and stop any Union invasion. However, Farragut is just like, maybe not, and then he says another important line that you should take note of, which is, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. Because the torpedoes had been in the water so long that the salt water had taken them out. So even though ships were literally bumping into them, none of them went off, and we took over Mobile Bay. Next up, General William T. Sherman also manages a series of concisive victories against the Confederacy as he marches towards the coast in his namesake, March to the Sea. After this, the Union sets sights on the Confederate Fort Fisher, and then they take it over. When Lincoln hears about this, he says, why there is nothing left for your ships to do. That's another quote that you should probably remember. Eventually, Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, the Confederacy was disbanded, and the Union was preserved. Now, a couple of things led to the downfall of the Confederacy. Even though analysis pretty much suggests that Robert E. Lee was the superior tactician in the middle of a battle, the South's overall grand strategy was just so much worse than the North's that they lost anyway. They were lacking in money, they were lacking in supplies, they were lacking in people, and the Union just kept battering them into submission. So after that, we begin the Reconstruction era, which is the process by which the South was reintegrated into the Union, slavery was slowly phased out, and by slowly phased out, I mean just amended straight out of the Constitution. And that brings us to the end of the Civil War. That's all I've got for today. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.